Hey everyone, in today's Community Spotlight episode, we're talking to longtime friend of the show, Kevin Myers. We're talking to him about how he got into networking and how his journey led him down a path that I would call somewhat non-traditional. So from disaggregation to building a consultative business around network architecture, we'll cover all this and more right after the break. Well, hey, Kevin, it's good to see you today. I understand you've been doing a lot of overnight cutovers and hanging out in some creepy colos. How's that?
Yeah, man. Hey, how you doing, man? It's good to see you. I will say, yeah, I've been had a lot of high op tempo for sure on the maintenance windows. I've had probably 10 or 11 in the last 3 weeks. With some travel thrown in there. And I have to say, like at 41, I know when I got into IT, which is what this is all about, is like, where did you start? At 21, it was a lot easier to be, hey, I'm not going to sleep for 5 days and do this. And at 41, I'm falling asleep in the data center more often. So for sure.
I'm so done with that. I'm so over that. Yeah, I still do it from time to time. And I'm like, every time I do it, I'm like, getting too old for this stuff.
Yep, for sure. And so the creepy colo, I actually went into a very interesting building in Louisville, Kentucky, where they have a building that was built in the 20s. And I mean, think Ghostbusters. Think of the Ghostbusters building that attracted like all the creepy stuff. It was like they put a data center in that. The elevators were condemned. We had to carry a Juniper up like 10 flights of stairs. It was like, and when you go to the basement, if you guys are a Stranger Things fan, we are fairly certain that Demogorgon lives in the basement of this DC. I mean, they have like generators and like electricity from the 1930s down there, like switches that are, it's like the crank
metal switches that you pull on. Yeah. All exposed. It's like, don't touch that. Yeah.
It was like the set of Young Frankenstein. So, but it was cool. It was a unique experience, but yeah, it was definitely creepy.
Oh man, that's funny. So man, we're here to talk about your story, and all stories kind of have a beginning. So let's start with yours. Like, how did you get into IT in general, and specifically, how did you get into networking?
Yeah, for sure. I think mine goes pretty far back, actually. I've always been fascinated with technology, and I definitely have my dad to thank for that. When I was about, I guess it was 6, so I was 5 or 6, we got our very first computer, and it was 1983, 84, somewhere in that neighborhood. And at the time, we hadn't really hit the x86 revolution, so there was a whole slew of, it was Tandy, and we had a TI-99. Which I actually brought something for show and tell because I recently went to my parents and got not one, but actually have 2 TI-99s that still work.
One?
I still have it with my favorite game here. I have Parsec, which was my most favorite game ever. And we did programming in TI Basic. My dad and I did.
Wow, that's cool.
So yeah, I was in kindergarten or, going to first grade, somewhere in that neighborhood. And we had programming magazines, which I picked up a few last year. And you would take a tape recorder, like a standard tape cassette that would hook into the computer, and you'd read the programs, out of the magazine. It wasn't like we were developing code at that point. You just read it out of the magazine and build a game, and you would hit record on the cassette tape. And if you screwed up, you had to stop the tape and go all the way back and retype the whole thing back over. So that was definitely that experience of like creating something, which is funny because I'm not a programmer now, so I don't really dabble in that. But that was my start. It really kind of sparked my imagination as to what you can do with technology and what you can do with computers. And it was actually really interesting because looking back as an adult, my dad, even though he isn't in technology, was always fascinated by it. He worked in retail, and I found a program when I picked this stuff up last year that he had written in BASIC to do like just-in-time inventory management, like in the 1980s for retail, store management. So that really sparked me into a lifelong love of technology and things that carried me forward into somewhere in the late 1980s is when we got our first x86 computer. And I remember the first time I solved a problem, the first time I actually troubleshot something was our Packard Bell 386, and it ran Windows 3.0. And Windows 3.1 came out. Well, of course, I had to take those 8 floppies and go upgrade it. And I'll never forget it because it was summer. My dad went off to work. And he said, "Don't touch that computer." And I was like waiting for him to leave. So the very first thing I did, of course, was I broke out the floppies and I started upgrading the computer. And it broke. So he came home the next night and we had to try to figure out what was going on. Didn't know what was going on. And So then he left for work the next day and said, we're going to have to get a PC repair guy to go look at this. Don't touch the computer. So, of course, I dove into the computer to figure out, exactly what was wrong with it, like a good tech.
What is it with the rebellious streak? And people
I don't know what it is. It's got to be a thing in IT that, I wasn't too rebellious. Like, I wasn't an awful child. But when it came to that stuff, it was like, curiosity killed the cat.
You can't tell me not to touch this technology. What do you?
Yeah.
Like, that's never going to happen. Get out of here.
Yeah, exactly. So I started looking at the autoexec.bat file, and I noticed that there were like some lines missing that I guess had gotten botched in the upgrade. And this was like 88, 89, maybe 9, 10 years old, something like that. So I finally figured out that something was missing in there. And I happened to find a copy of the old autoexec.bat, replaced the lines that were missing, and the computer booted again into Windows. So my dad comes back and he's like, all right, let's look at this. I was like, well, I actually fixed it. So of course he gets really mad and stops himself. He's like, I told you not to touch it, but what'd you do?
Yeah.
What did you fix? So that was
now, but I don't want to show you that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm mad, but I also don't have to get a PC tech. So like that experience of like solving that first problem, like it was pretty much over from that point. I stayed in technology, in the 80s. I would dial into BBSs. I had a lot of friends that had computers at that time. And I remember getting onto the internet very, very early, in the modem days, and messing around with all that in the 80s and 90s, upgrading the computer. And then that kind of got forward to the very first networking that I ever touched. I didn't really understand it. I didn't really get what was going on. But when I was in high school, I took Pascal and C. And our instructor was very, very knowledgeable in Unix. We worked on a Unix mainframe, and this was 94, 95, somewhere in there. And we just started writing code, and that's probably the last time I wrote any kind of decent code. We started messing around with all that. And it was, kind of networked. We had the workstations were networked over, I think it was BNC or something like that, back into the Unix mainframe. Mm-hmm. And that was a really cool experience because I started to see not only what was possible on one computer, but the computers connected together. And the one thing I do remember about that class was it was the first time I'd ever heard the word the internet. It wasn't in common culture then. Nobody knew what it was. And it was like 94. And he said, well, we're going to talk about the internet today in class. And of course, we're all looking around like, what exactly is that? Because we'd done the modems, but we didn't really know about the internet. Right. And so that, carried forward into the next few years where I actually started an IT career. My family moved away from Indianapolis, where I grew up, down south. And I wanted to go to engineering school, so I went to Auburn, which is my little joke about my company is this is why my colors are orange and blue, even though my business partner in Denver says it's the Denver Broncos. It's not. It's totally Auburn. So, so I got into IT at that point after going through college and going into computer engineering. I got through about 2 or 3 years of college, and I decided to take a break. So I come back home with my parents and try to figure out, what I'm going to do. I realized that I wasn't doing great in college. Like I loved the material, but I was more into, going out and having a good time. And so I kind of took a pause in my life. And at that point, our next door neighbor actually needed somebody to work on the tech in his office. He owned a law firm that worked in healthcare and needed somebody to touch the tech. And I was sitting around figuring out what I was going to do. So I was like, I'll go do this for a few months. And that just was that was 1998, and that just opened my world into IT. I was completely hooked because we had a Windows NT server, a gateway Windows NT server. We had an Ethernet network with, 10 meg switches and a Cisco router and a frame relay circuit, and it was completely over after that.
Switches, huh?
Yeah, switches. Oh yeah, we had. I think it's funny. I think I configured my first VLAN in the early 90s, even though I really had no idea what I was doing. Like I didn't really get it. I just copied what somebody else did. So. But the interesting thing for me is that I really did not go full force into network engineering right away. I probably spent about 10 years as an IT generalist, mostly because it occurred during my 20s. And again, kind of like the college streak, I was, wanted to travel and have fun and do different things. So I was a decent IT guy, but I didn't really get the drive that I have now, where I really just want to learn all the things and continue to push the boundaries of technology until the latter 10 years. I kind of had that spark the first 2 years, and then I had a little bit of an IT burnout, and I worked for a number of different companies, all that kind of helped grow my career. But it wasn't until I got into network engineering heavily that I really, that things really changed for me, that I really started to push and pursue my IT career very, very seriously.
Speaking about that, that generalist role, though, I think that those even, I think there's so much value in that generalist role. I think the people who skip that, and there's nothing, there's no predefined path. You don't have to do it, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the idea of having a solid understanding of how everything else works helps people who go into a specialization, whether that be networking or compute or whatever, like whatever it is that they do.
Oh yeah.
Having the broad level understanding. So even though you probably weren't learning in that time, you were, and you didn't know it. Right?
No, you're 100% right. You're totally right, because I didn't realize that until IT has matured, because, a couple things were going on at that time. IT was, before that it was information systems and data systems, and we had like 9 different names for it in the 80s and early 90s. And then IT was kind of born, out of the mid to late 90s and became a thing. And I know a lot of us were there for the dawn of that age and the .com boom. And we went through all these things, and we all had that background. We built PCs and we stood up servers, and we were there when virtualization first became a thing. So you're absolutely right. I worked with a few people that were great people, but didn't have that foundation. And when it came time to, troubleshoot something, there was, an issue with something in a PCI slot or loading an operating system or those generalist tasks. I realized that not everybody does have that background anymore. Some people kind of start very, into a specialization very early and don't really do the generalist piece.
Yeah. All right. So you said about 10 years in your career, something started to change. So what changed then?
So I think a couple things changed for me. I was getting to a point in my life where my wife and I were dating, and we would probably be getting married soon. So I knew that a life change was happening. So there was that going on. And I also, even before that, about a year or two before that, I kind of got to the point where I was like, I've been messing around with servers and desktop support and all these different things and a little bit of networking for a long time. And I'd gotten a CCNA a really long time ago in 2003. Passed it. Did okay. I understood a few things out of it, but I just didn't really get it. Like, I had it, but I didn't get it. So I got to this point where I said, I really want to understand this stuff. I want to go through certifications and want to really understand this. And I actually started with a Windows cert. And that was the first cert that I pursued, like, really aggressively, where my goal was to learn the technology and not just get the cert. So I dove into servers, and I was like, I'm just going to, consume this. And in doing that, I started spending a lot of time with the networking side, again, coming back to it, because I was doing testing imaging over servers and seeing the performance issues when you're, multicasting all that out and unicasting it. And so I decided, I was like, I think I want to look for a networking job, and I think I want to push towards a networking job. And it just so happened at the time, right after I passed my MCP, I think it was on Windows Server, Windows XP, or something like that, there was a job for a telco, a local telco and a regional telco, where they wanted somebody that had Cisco skills and a number of different IT skills. And I thought, man, I am like so underqualified for this, but I'm just going to give it a shot, because I've been in IT 10 years and I've got, a decent amount of skills. So, and they had this, like, it's kind of funny. You and I joke about, giving tests during interviews, because I know we've had that conversation back and forth on that one. And I got like the longest, like, knowledge dump test you've ever seen. I think I remember, I was like, well, I remember conf T and I remember the interface command, but beyond that, like, I didn't remember a whole lot. But I think I had a decent attitude. They hired me anyway and took a chance. And then I spent the next 3 years consuming like pretty much everything I could possibly find on network engineering. And I went from the point of barely being able to subnet to the end of it. I was designing redundant BGP route reflectors, putting out MPLS services, ATM over MPLS, IPTV. I mean, you name it. There were all these initiatives as a regional rural telco that they were wanting to build out and doing these different things. And that just totally launched me into network engineering. And it's kind of been a sprint ever since, but that was definitely the catalyst.
It sounds really interesting too, because it sounds like, so I speak for myself, maybe I speak for you. I feel like there was a point in my career that I didn't know enough to know that stuff was risky.
Right? Yeah, you're right.
So
you're absolutely right.
I took on things that were way above my head, because I'm like, if someone else can do it, I can do it.
I mean, that's the thing. And it did not dawn on me until later, like, because this is like, especially when you're in a telco, you're dealing with 911, because you're the incumbent carrier for that. So you have all these critical services that hospitals and police departments and all these things that you've got to keep online. And so trying to, learn and understand through that, you're right. I was just like, oh, we're going to do this stuff and it's cool. And, we were careful, but the impact of it didn't dawn on me till much later.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, so that telco was like the kind of the first foray or first stretch into the service provider world, which you do spend a lot of time in now, right?
I do, yeah. I mean, I find myself spending most of my time in the service provider world, but I still do touch enterprise often enough to, to do some stuff in my consulting. So yeah, that kind of got me into a point where, I was doing okay at the service provider, network engineering wise, it was awesome. Pay wise, I really wanted to make more money. So I just so happened that I pursued my CCNP. In fact, I first probably back up and say, because you and I go back and forth on Cisco certification. We have these conversations all the time in Network Collective. But I will say, and I think Nick Russo said this too, and I agree with him 100%, that was probably one of the most valuable certifications I have ever been through in my entire life. The Cisco CCNP is what took me from being decent at the network I knew to exposing me to all the things that I had never worked on and didn't know, and gave me enough of a technical foundation that I could teach myself. That was the thing that really allowed me to teach myself things that I didn't know, because you're never going to know all of it. But if you know how to learn, that you learn how to learn, I guess. And I guess you guys that work at the CCIE, when you go through the CCIE, it's such an intensive program. I think you take learning how to learn to like another level, when you're doing that.
But I still, having gone through the CCIE, I still look at my CCNP as being the most valuable thing I did for my career. I could have survived without the CCIE. It's definitely opened a bunch of doors that wouldn't have been open otherwise.
Right.
And I don't, I'm firmly of the belief that it's a valuable, level of effort. But if I hadn't, the CCNP is what would have made the differentiation between me flaming out in networking and me being successful in networking. And it's not just the certification. And I don't want to get on the certification talk necessarily.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But it's the content in it. So even if you don't go after the cert, understanding what's on that blueprint will give you the foundation for moving forward. And so, yeah, that's definitely one of the most functional certifications I've ever done.
And it is, and I think that's and that's the thing that and coming back from the early 2000s where certifications were a lot more paper than practical, Cisco put a lot of work into making it practical. And if you pursue the certification as it's intended, you're right, you get the cert, but the practical knowledge you get from those hundreds of hours of labbing. Because I remember sitting, and my wife was like, "Is this ever going to end?" And that's what I remember sitting there in all those hours of labbing, and at that time I still had to have some physical equipment because we didn't quite have some of the wonderful things we have in GNS3, which I used, but the switching and the private VLANs and all that stuff was, all there. But yeah, that time that I put in, that flight time, and I teach my engineers today, I say, if I learn nothing out of Cisco certification and trying to expand your knowledge, because I have engineers that are trying to go for those today, I said, don't spend 80% of your time reading and 20% of your time labbing. Spend 80% of your time labbing and then read what you need to fill in the gaps, and you are going to learn it. And I said, if I'd known that, I probably could have taken my year and 8 months of CCNP and maybe done it in 6 months instead of, sitting through all the videos and reading the books cover to cover and all of that. So, but yeah, that was a huge piece for me. So that kind of set the stage for me to go into the enterprise. And I didn't even know I was headed there. In fact, my plan was to go for the CCIE immediately after CCNP. But a little thing kind of happened in the middle of that, which was I got introduced to a technology outside of Cisco called MikroTik, which we've talked about a whole lot. And one day my boss comes in the telco right before, not too long before I left, and he said, we found this router, and it's like $50, and it does MPLS and BGP. And of course, that was like throwing a big fat T-bone steak into a bunch of dogs into the engineering bullpen.
Right.
You're like, no way, no way.
Let me see.
So,
yeah.
I think we spent the next 2 or 3 weeks attaching it to the Cisco core that we had built. We were running Cisco 7606s and 7609s and a service provider triple play architecture where we did TV, voice, data, all that. Mm-hmm. And so we were doing like VPLS, and we were doing L3 VPN and all these different technologies with these little $50 routers. And we actually put it out in an enterprise client that needed, at that time, I think they had like a 20 or 30 meg Metro Ethernet synchronous circuit. So we were like, oh, well, let's put this out and see if it works. And so we did, and it worked. And so that kind of started my road down working in, technologies that now we call it white box, we call it commodity. At the time, it was the cheap router. But it was, so that kind of got me started on that track. And I've kind of pursued that throughout my career, but then I jumped to the enterprise. And I won't lie, mainly it was for the money. They offered an incredibly attractive package. It was a lot more than I was making. We were about to have our second baby at the time, my wife and I. So I was like, I would love service provider networking, but I'm going to go try this.
But money's good too. Yeah.
Yeah, the money was good too. So I was like, I went and interviewed with a company and went to work for a really large enterprise. It was a global enterprise that I think at the time they had like 20 or 30,000 employees, and then they went through a merger and not long after I got there, and then they had like 80,000 global employees. So it was this massive network to work on. And that was probably also one of the most beneficial things I did, because even though I had a really good foundation in routing and switching and could do just about anything in layer 2 or layer 3 that we put out in the telco, the piece that I was missing was the applications. Up to that point, I was like, I don't care what you put on my networking. It's applications. Who cares? It's packets in, packets out. And it wasn't until I sat with those application teams and understood the impact that the things that we do in networking had on the application layer, and things like latency, like the long fat pipe. We had data centers in other countries, and we put up a gig circuit, and the application guys were like, well, we can only get like a 50 meg speed test. And we were all like, well, that's not right. Something's wrong with the carrier. And then we learned about latency and TCP window size and buffer size and all those fun things. So that really helped to fill out my understanding, I think, of more of the OSI stack, of understanding how applications interact. And even in the carrier space, it helped me out a ton, because there are a lot of, in the carrier space, we do still sometimes have that attitude that, hey, man, our network works. You just, your stuff is messed up. But when you go look at the way applications interact, you can kind of solve some problems that if you didn't have that background working with the application and DB and storage teams, that you wouldn't otherwise maybe see. So it was incredibly valuable for me to go do that. And then I went into consulting after that. I finally had gotten to a point where I said, I really want to work for myself. And I'd been building this company, which is now IP Architects, that I'm a partner and a stakeholder in. And we've been building it up over several years. It was kind of a part-time thing at first, and then it became more full-time. And then finally, we just all went full-time and started growing the company and doing different things. And that was all a wonderful foundation, because I'd had several years in service provider, several years in enterprise. And so taking those two together gave me a pretty good base, consulting-wise, to kind of go into what I've been doing for the last 5 years, which is, getting into the realm of white box and commodity and just a bunch of different, angles of consulting.
That's really cool. I mean, that's an interesting progression. Your comment about application stack's really funny, because I think out of everyone, I think you and I, we spar a bit on L2 extension only because of perspective. And the funny thing,
for sure.
I think we see each other's points incredibly well, because you know it and I know it. As a service provider, you use it all the time, right?
No, yeah, it's like Skittles. We put L2 extensions out like Skittles, man. It's like throw 1,000 of them out. I don't care.
So every time I give it a hard time, you come around, it's like, yeah, well, we use it all the time. But then it's like, yeah, but you got to put an application on it. Well, it's like, well,
right. Well, see, I think that's one area we definitely do agree, because I had somebody, I was responding to a forum post the other day. There was a forum post that I was responding to online. Somebody said, I have five data center locations in different countries, and I want to put one network across all of them. So my first question was, dear God, why? What have you been told that you need to do this? And it's interesting. Even in 2019, the person that was making the post, he just didn't understand the ramifications of doing it. It wasn't an application requirement. It wasn't vMotion or any of that stuff. It was simply, I just thought it would be easier if everything was in the same subnet. But we had a conversation. I said, maybe consider a routed network. And then if you have specific services that you get forced into, then maybe, consider that as an overlay.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to ask you a couple of questions. I've got a couple of stock questions. So we kind of get the story up through IP Architects. These questions, I think they're incredibly tied to people's stories. And so I think that's it's a nice tie into what's here. But I like talking, since we talked a lot about your history, I want to talk about now. And what I want to ask is, what do you think? And I'm going to ask you the converse of this afterwards, so just kind of be preparing. But
okay, sure.
What do you think is like the most positive or best trend in the industry right now? What is something that's happening that you think people should be paying attention to?
Well, this is probably not going to be any huge surprise for you, that I think the disaggregation movement that we're going through right now is probably the most positive thing that I've seen in network engineering, because I think it's taken a very static environment that I've seen in the traditional network vendors, where they're used to putting out some of the same offerings and the same things year after year. And yes, there's different innovations, but I think that disaggregation kind of forced everybody to look at the way that we do things. And you look at the white box space and you look at commodity networking and companies like MikroTik and Ubiquiti. And when I first started in this, there was definitely, a bit of, there's no way I'm putting a $50 router in my critical network. It's just not going to happen. But then you look at some of the initiatives that some really large companies have done. And of course, everybody touts the Facebooks and the Googles. And of course, I use those examples because, they just realized from a cost and scale perspective, there was no way they were going to be able to build what they built in Facebook and Amazon and Google without lowering the cost of infrastructure. And we're seeing that play out now with 5G. I mean, 5G, even though it's kind of it's not a defined term because there is no standard right now, and everybody's kind of trying to figure out what 5G actually is. The one thing that everybody does agree on is that it's so ubiquitous that they have to lower the cost of infrastructure or it's never going to happen. So, you can't put a $10,000 router into every tower to, or AP point to do this. And so, but you look at companies like, I'll give you a good example I saw published recently, Kroger. Kroger, I think, ripped out all of their vendor routers they're one of the largest grocers in the country. And they went to just a Linux box. They had basically I think it was like a small hypervisor they put into their stores and went through and wrote the applications that they needed that best fit their company. And put a routing stack in there so that they could handle routing, and basically built this solution that really fit their company best and their company needs best, did an R&D on it, and they rolled it out to like 4,000 locations. Wow. And so you think of a company, a multi-billion-dollar company that's in retail and grocery like that, and is actually in their vertical. I think they're the leading company in their vertical that does something innovative like that. And I think other companies can follow that model. And a lot of people think it's just about the cost. And yes, there's definitely that element too. But things that I've heard other people say is, being able to define what you want your technology to look like, and like having control of your own destiny, and not having a vendor come back and say, well, that chassis had a good run, but we're done. And this had a good run, but we're going to do this technology now. So, and that's not to say either that it's an either or conversation, because most of the networks that I work on, we've got some Cisco, we have some Juniper, we have some things in there, because there's definitely roles that we've not filled yet in white box and commodity. There's things that you still need a traditional vendor for. They still do a great job in, and then you can build the rest of the network out, with these other commodity components. So it's never I'm going to rip all this out and it's all going to be this. It's always an integration. But I see that as a very positive trend, because I think that's forcing us to look at networking differently. It's forcing the vendors to look at networking differently and compete. And all the major vendors have started to build disaggregated operating systems. I was at Network Field Day, the service provider edition, where we were talking about segment routing, and I was talking with Cisco's engineers, and they've disaggregated iOS XR. And I said, what's your challenge in putting this on there? And they said, really, it's just getting more companies to want to put this on different platforms. They said, we're very excited about it and we want to do it. We just need to validate it on more hardware platforms. And it was the 5G providers that actually forced them to do it, because they said, look, we want your code. We just want it on an edge core box. And right. So, and that's the way we want to roll. So, and Juniper is doing the same thing. So I think it's changing the way we do networking. It's making it like the server model. It's making it, we did this with servers in the 80s and 90s and disaggregated that. And now we're doing the same thing in networking.
Right. So if you're listening to this and you don't know a lot about disaggregation, we've done quite a few shows on it actually. And we have like a good primer show, a couple other discussions around disaggregation and what it means from a business perspective. It'd be definitely worth checking those out, because I agree disaggregation is a great trend that's going on right now. So what's the inverse? What's something that you think people should be wary of? What's a trend that's going on right now that you kind of go, man, I don't know if that's a good thing?
Man, I've thought long and hard about all the ways I could get into trouble on your show.
This is the question that does it. This is the reason why.
Yes, I know. So luckily, being my own boss, somewhat, I can limit that a little bit. But I think that I think the biggest trend that I see, that I've started to see discussion around, is that I see in the engineering community the advent of cloud and the advent of all the layers of abstraction that the road that we're going down now. I see new engineers getting into this industry that are trying to figure out their career path, don't see as much value in the basic core skills, and I don't think it's all their fault. I think the industry is leading them to believe that route switch is no longer a fundamental component. You don't need to go through these fundamental concepts because it's all going to be abstracted and it's going to be in cloud. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's really dangerous to me, because if you don't have core route switch fundamentals and you don't have a good command of the OSI stack and understand how all of the different bits and pieces come together at layer 1, 2, 3, and all the way on up the stack, I think that's going to be the biggest challenge we have out of the next generation of engineers. Is everything is so hyper focused on cloud that when it breaks, you have to understand the bits beneath it. Software defined networking is the same kind of thing. I'm just now getting into some of that with OpenFlow, and starting to dabble in that. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's yes, we're going to, wrap software and intelligence and automation and orchestration around all these things. But at the end of the day, BGP is still BGP. VLANs are still VLANs, and you have to know how they work. So that to me is the most dangerous trend that I hope we, come back off of and continue to teach those fundamentals and push those fundamentals to the engineers that are coming in now.
Yeah, I mentioned this. I've mentioned this multiple times, but on the show that released the week that we're recording this, and that is that abstraction is only super effective, or full abstraction only works when everything that's underneath it is 100% reliable and works every single time.
Oh, for sure.
Because the moment that abstraction or what the technologies that are being abstracted breaks, it is like orders of magnitude harder to troubleshoot something that's abstracted than something that is up there and open.
Oh, definitely. There's no question about that.
That's assuming you have the skills. And so, we see this move towards these black box systems, and I agree. There are new networkers coming into the world that are being fed this message, and maybe the message is right. Maybe we're just early. It's completely possible that 10 years down the line we really have solved these problems, but I don't see it today. And so people see people starting their careers as if that's true, that the networking problem is solved, is all just needs to be abstracted. But I know you're going into very complicated networks. I'm going into very complicated networks. These networks are not, the problem is not solved.
Yeah.
It's that someone can just wrap the box around and make it do what it needs to do, and that's it.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that, because I remember seeing something that struck me in telco networking, that somebody showed me a list of troubleshooting steps for a telco technician in the 1920s. And the troubleshooting steps that a telco technician went through in the 1920s were not vastly different from the troubleshooting steps that an IP network engineer goes through in today. So if 100 years ago we were doing some of the very same things to troubleshoot a telephone network that we do today and following the same logic processes, I think the technology will differ. It will grow. There will be all these wonderful things. But I think the core fundamentals of how to troubleshoot the technology that we're on are going to remain largely the same for the next 20, 30, 40 years and even beyond.
All right. Well, Kevin, thanks for coming on, joining us, sharing your story. That was a great conversation. Before we leave, I want to give you an opportunity, though, to share where people might find you online. So yeah,
for sure. So if you find me on Twitter, I'm at StubArea51, which is also my blog at StubArea51.net. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm on there. I'm on Facebook with my IP Architects is my consulting company. We do network engineering all over the world, doing mostly white box and commodity networking, but traditional stuff is too. That's IPArchitects.com, and I think that's definitely all the ways to find me.
Awesome. So I'm Jordan Martin. You can find me at BCJordo on Twitter, by my name on LinkedIn, all those other places. TheNetworkCollective.com is our website. From there, you can find all our past episodes. You can learn about Network Collective membership, which just became even more affordable. And all the places to subscribe to us online. So we'd also love to hear from you. So if you want to chat with us, you can find us at Net Collective PC on Twitter. We're also on LinkedIn and Facebook as Network Collective Podcast. You can just search for us there. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.